Now, we'll move to our second presenter. Sheena Jary is a PhD candidate in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Her dissertation, entitled Free Will and the Ethics of Social Cohesion, 17th Century England During the Spatial Reformation, examines how the cultural production of space extends to the production and manipulation of social space, with the goal of achieving stability or balance. More specifically, Sheena's dissertation discusses the ways in which the cultural production of space intersects with concepts like free will, self-regulation, and the ethics of individual social behavior, all of which impact social cohesion in post-Civil War England. Her paper is titled Margaret Cavendish and Spatial Contingency.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Sheena Jary. I am a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and I'm going to be talking today a bit about Margaret Cavendish and something that I call spatial typology. So before we get started, we're going to be talking a bit about these two texts. So the World's Olio, published in 1655, is an interesting array of reflections, mainly on social issues. And then the Grounds of Natural Philosophy, her mature natural philosophy tract, published in 1688. And we're going to be talking about these relative to social space, natural space, so the space of nature, and manifestations of free will. All right, so Margaret Cavendish's treatment of free will is a contentious topic for scholars, some of whom argue that her understanding of free will is similar to that of Thomas Hobbes, but that unlike Hobbes, Cavendish believes that the human will is free, not necessitated. Yet, if free will is voluntary, then the element of choice would negate her essentialist practices in her writing, especially in her social writing. At the same time, some critics claim that Cavendish's politics do not reflect Hobbesian absolutism, but are instead a revolutionary new way to conceive of the individual's relationship to the cosmos. Others argue that Cavendish cannot possibly advocate for free will due to her inequitable treatment of women, or that she is a determinist, which would dispute the claim that Cavendish believes the will acts voluntarily. So rather than attempting to discern Cavendish's actual philosophy of free will or a single philosophy of free will, this paper approaches the dissimilarities in her treatment of free will from the perspective of spatial typology. What I mean by this is that free will manifests differently in Cavendish's mature tract, The Grounds of Natural Philosophy, than it does in the social philosophy expounded in the World's Olio. I argue that what scholars have identified as discrepancies in Cavendish's treatment of free will are in fact indicative of the type of space in which free will is manifest. In nature, this type of space is homogeneous, which aligns with Michael Sauter's research on the spatial reformation of the early modern period, which I'm going to get to in a second. However, the social space constructed in the Olio is necessarily heterogeneous. Thus, the type of space determines how free will manifests, which is why I argue that Cavendish holds two seemingly opposite beliefs about free will that are concurrently true if free will is examined through the lens of spatial typology. I will compare Cavendish's treatment of free will in the Grounds and in the Olio in order to discuss these perceived variations, most of which are related to Cavendish's intense desire to reestablish social order in the post-Civil War era. But before I proceed, I want to offer a bit of context with respect to an intellectual movement coined by Sauter as the Spatial Reformation. In the Spatial Reformation, Euclid Between Man, Cosmos, and God, it was published in 2019, Sauter has argued that the return of Euclid's elements marks the beginning of a period of rapid change in how people understood space. So with incredible attention to detail, Sauter explains that the elements led early modern thinkers to understand space as homogeneous. Matter constituted space, but all space was considered to be part of the same canvas or backdrop for human experience and material engagement. However, Sauter does not engage with the social space in which matter constituted heterogeneous space, made that nature, the nature of that space heterogeneous. So for the purposes of this paper, there are two things you need to understand about the spatial reformation. So one, it qualified all space as homogeneous, and in doing so, it two, deconstructed the Aristotelian hierarchy that had traditionally placed God above and humankind below. The collapse of this hierarchy is significant to our conversation here because Christian monarchies were fashioned along the same lines of this Aristotelian hierarchy. The deconstruction of which destabilized political institutions, allowing the opportunity for civil war and political dissidence. Cavendish witnessed both the abolition and restoration of the monarchy, and the anxiety surrounding social instability is present in her work, especially in the relatively understudied World's Olio, which focuses primarily on social space and how this space should be structured so as to achieve social order or cohesion. Social space is a concept developed through the social process, as Martina Lowe explains. It is characterized by its relativity because it is the relationships between material, so human beings, that constitute its existence and purpose. The Olio delves into these relationships. It examines the purpose of the social space, which for Cavendish is to maintain internal order. So for Cavendish, order is the direct result of rigid social structure, which is heterogeneous. Rigid social structure makes homogeneous space impossible because it accentuates relational differences between diverse social actors who constitute the social space and its heterogeneity. However, this is not the case with nature. And just as a brief aside, I just want to acknowledge that critics continue to debate the status of free will in Cavendish's natural philosophy, specifically with regard to the status of matter as self-moving and whether or not there are disorders, true disorders in nature. So let us turn now to the homogeneous space of Cavendish's grounds. Nature's parts, like societies, are distinct. But what unifies nature as a single body at peace within itself is that the parts have no individual self-interest. Its unity constitutes homogeneous space. Cavendish illustrates this point referencing the human body. And she writes, "A man is composed of several parts, yet none or not any of those different parts or corporeal motions are a hindrance to each other. Nature's parts have self-determination and move freely, but gain nothing from deviating from their prescribed role." Cavendish argues that it is in the best interest of each of nature's parts to maintain cohesion and harmony. So in other words, nature's parts freely choose unity, so emphasis on this being a choice on their part. Acting in their own best interest is the same as acting in the best interest of the whole. Nature is but one united material body, writes Cavendish. Its ability to maintain internal order eliminates confusion, because after all, she says, where unity is not, order cannot be. Nature's unity defines its space as homogeneous. Parts of nature may be distinct, but all parts are of equal value and have equal freedom to determine their motion. In the grounds, Cavendish comments on the balance that sustains nature as a unified whole, writing that only by their close conjunction and near relation, nature's parts unite in one and the same actions, which is followed by the assertion that several sorts, kinds, and differences of particulars cause order by reason it causes distinctions. For if all creatures were alike, it would cause a confusion. Despite the differences between parts in nature, Cavendish insists that nature's parts willingly cooperate. It is not that nature's parts have no individual self-interest. Rather, it is that the basic need for self-preservation is fulfilled simply by acting out its role, this part's role, which in turn serves the interests of the natural society. Cavendish refers to this as a society in nature as well. Society's human parts, on the other hand, so in social space, fail to achieve this unity because human beings naturally have different interests, and these interests are infrequently aligned with the interests of other people in that society. By acting according to one's own interests in a human society, one may not be acting in the interests of other social actors. In the social space of world oleo, parts are also distinct, but what makes them disorderly is, as I mentioned, self-interest, a concept which ironically is woven through the social structure of the oleo. So in a sense, Cavendish's goal of ideating an orderly social space would have been undercut by the oleo itself, had it ever been established as a guide for social structure. For Cavendish, these differences were not meant to bring people together. Rather, they were designed to set people apart, which is the premise of rigid social hierarchy. Nature is a body of equally important parts, but according to Cavendish, society achieves sustained order only when hierarchical structure assigns value to its parts based on their social position. In the oleo, inequality fuels Cavendish's construction of an orderly social space. In fact, Cavendish ensures the prevalence of inequality by constructing an ideal social space founded upon the essentialist belief that when, quote, every man is living in his degree, envy is abated, pride abated, luxury abated, neighborly love and kindness bred, and peace kept. And this is because, quote, everyone thrives in his quality and grows rich by frugality, and riches beget care, care begets fear, and modest fear keeps peace. Living in one's degree speaks to Cavendish's understanding of England's socioeconomic structure. She is an essentialist who believes that people are born into their social position. And a great example being that Cavendish claims that the nobility are born with merit. So when in fact merit is obviously something that is earned in life, it's not a birthright. A rigid social hierarchy is Cavendish's solution to discourage people from their degree or quality. In fact, her explanation of the need to live according to one's degree falls into the section wherein she outlines the causes of rebellion. So to exemplify her point, Cavendish writes, "For when a noble man seeth an inferior person in as good or better equipage than himself, it begets envy. And envy causes murmur, faction, rebellion." She writes this as she attempts to explain the dangers of social mobility. So Cavendish argues that living beyond one's social status as determined by birth is dangerous. The so-called inferior sort, this is how she refers to them consistently in the oleo, must be separated from the nobility or other more superior classes. The relationships between human beings on a personal level can escalate quickly into civil war, which is why Cavendish takes great care to outline the composition of the Commonwealth. So this passage is a bit long, but indicative for sure. So she says this Commonwealth to be composed of nobility, gentry, burgesses, peasants, in which are comprised soldiery, merchantry, artificers, laborers, commanders, officers, masters, servants, magistrates, divines, lawyers, and etc. This Commonwealth to be governed by one head or governor as a king, for one head is sufficient for one body. For several heads breed several opinions, and several opinions breed disputations, and disputations factions, and factions breed wars, and wars bring ruin and desolation. Cavendish's remark that several heads breed several opinions leads to disputes. It's indicative of corrupt self-love, which becomes a cynical version of self-interest. I know this is a loaded term that was something that was developed more so in the 18th century, but I don't get into that here. So while self-love in nature is symbiotic, self-love in society strives for, quote, preeminency and command as it pursues what she calls ambitious desires. For the purposes of this paper, I refer to corrupt self-love as self-interest. Self-interest is precisely why Cavendish views hierarchy as essential to the cohesion of social space. Thus, in order for the kingdom to remain secure and orderly, it must limit relational crossovers between people of different classes so as to ensure that self-interest cannot take the nation's helm and guide it once more into civil war. By placing limitations on an individual's ability to act freely or dare to live beyond their station, Cavendish immediately limits free will. One can only practice self-determination or freedom of choice within their social place that she assigns to them with this hierarchy. To the question of homogeneous space, so as a reminder, Sauter believes or argues that all space at this time was considered homogeneous. So let's talk about why that doesn't apply to society. So if you were to accept Sauter's premise that all space was understood as homogeneous, there would be serious implications for the social space. If Cavendish were to homogenize society, it would indeed eliminate hierarchy and inequality, but it would destroy individual identity, freedom of conscience, and free will. It seems contradictory to say that were Cavendish to homogenize social space in the olio in the same way that as natural space by weighing all parts equally, that individual identity and free will would be negatively affected because she would also be eliminating social hierarchy. And for Cavendish, this is the recipe for civil war. Furthermore, if all parts of society were of equal value in the olio, then no parts of that society would have self-interest, which is a natural part of subjectivity and the reason that Cavendish insists on social stratification. If there were no subjectivity, then free will would be absent because it is predicated on the presence of subjective interests, desires, perspectives, and needs. If that society's human parts were exactly like the material parts in nature, then by Cavendish's own reasoning, their sole desire would be to promote the longevity and well-being of the whole, or the commonwealth. Although these social parts could successfully self-regulate to maintain a balanced society, they would have no individual interest, nor would they enjoy the element of choice. Following this logic, even if the individual actors, so the humans or the parts of the whole, did enjoy freedom of choice, they would not benefit from deviating from their essential purpose. So, for example, a cobbler would not benefit from living above station because his sole purpose, according to Cavendish, is to make shoes, just as the sole purpose of a parliamentarian would be to serve, and to do otherwise would really be fruitless. Freedom of choice and self-determination would then be moot points. In Cavendish's eyes, it would be in one's best interest to preserve the whole, simply because without it, there would be no body to structure the parts and chaos would ensue. If Cavendish's social space were to become the same type of space as nature, so homogeneous, then the human beings who constitute the existence of social space would lose their autonomy because they would be condemned to live for only one reason, to complete their function or essential purpose and nothing more. Essentially, what we end up seeing in the olio is that free will is spatially contingent in two ways. So one, it's contingent upon the type of space, so whether it is homogeneous or heterogeneous, that affects how free will manifests. And two, it's contingent upon one's place in the social space. So the greatest limitations to free will are imposed on, again, what Cavendish calls the inferior sort. Cavendish's variations in her philosophy of free will are not self-contradictory. Rather, they represent the author's own understanding of the philosophical discrepancies that occur in the two vastly different spaces of nature and society. In nature, free will is unimpeded, though each part lacks the autonomy to act freely. In society, free will is impeded, but individual autonomy is present to various degrees. Likewise, in nature, the regulatory function lies in the hands of its individual parts, but in society, regulation lies in the hands of the state, which is why free will is contingent upon the type of space in which it is manifest and the place one holds in that social space.
Thank you very much indeed, Sheena, for that wonderful, very lucid and informative look at the social reformation, social space, and social typology in relation to Cavendish and other political theorists.